Tonight, we will be discussing privacy and decentralization, blockchain, a lot of these terms that have been flying around Berlin. I have been working in the scene for just 3 weeks now, so when they asked me to moderate this panel, I know they think it was because I might present a more neutral opinion, but I think it's really just because I'm going to ask easier questions. So I want to make sure tonight we leave lots of space for you guys, the real experts in the room, to be able to ask questions. And until then, our panelists are going to be talking about what privacy looks like on the web today, and how privacy is changing with decentralized technologies. What are the risks that some of these things can pose, and how does self-sovereign identity play into the entire thing? Sitting on the panel with me, I have Balázs Mehti, whose name I will not pronounce correctly. But he is the founder of Takanu, which is working on building a blockchain-based digital identity platform. We have Natalie Eichler, who's an attorney here at DWF, specializing in commerce law, contract law, and data protection law. Greg McMullen, he's also a lawyer based here in Berlin, working for Blockchain Bundesverband, where he chairs the privacy and blockchain subsection. And Kai is one of my colleagues here at Jolocom, and we are currently building a protocol for the self-sovereign identity platform and user-facing mobile app. My name is Ellie Stevens, also working at Jolocom, again in communications. I'm actually going to leave it to Kai now to give us a brief overview of self-sovereign identity, how it works, what it is, kind of the basis so we can all catch up and be on the same page before we get digging into the questions.
Thank you very much. I might just stand up quickly, and thank you very much for being here tonight. So I'm really just having the role to introduce you all to the concept of self-sovereign identity. Jolocom as a company is actively working on making this a reality, but we always try to put an effort on making sure that everybody gets this to be a general concept and a general new paradigm in the world of digital identity, access right management, and the whole handling of personal data. So even though we as Jolocom present this event to you today, and the slides that you'll see are Jolocom kind of branded, this is a general concept that is trying to get a new identity paradigm out there and a new model and framework for how we build and model digital identities, and also how we as individuals hold them based on an open set of standards to enable a universal identity layer. And I just kind of dive into that now. Sorry, we are unable to click through PDFs in this computer. It's a bit weird. So the world of identity on the web today, or in the digital space, is very much structured like this. You have hundreds of them. Some people might be able to collect a few more, some people might collect a few less, but in general, you collect a new identity with each single service you start to use and interact, which can sum up to, I think in Joachim's case, it was 297 when he counted some years back. And I think in my case by now, since I started using a password manager, which is still the kind of default option you can go to, I collected about 200 as well. So we really just accumulate digital identities, or like better access utensils along the way. And the kind of identity world we're in looks a lot like this. The identity, in this case, we always go to Sarah, because Sarah is a great example of all this mess we're currently in. Sarah is faced with the challenge to go into the interaction with different services via identity providers. And that's just the concept that we've all been accustomed to in the last, I would say, 20 years. The simplest form of an identity provider today is usually when you have a username and password. Like, that's kind of how it started back in the days, and that's, in the end, what we're still having today. We get a bit more complex with having federated identity providers that allow you to use an identity you created with a social network, like for example Facebook or Google, in other places as well. So you can now log into Airbnb using your Google account. But is this truly an identity that is workable for you, that is putting you in control, that is giving you the chance to control your privacy? Probably not. It actually is just a large centralization, and this is one important term tonight, a centralization of power and a centralization of data in the hands of very few actors. And these actors are identity providers. And Jolocom as a company started out to change this by essentially introducing disruption of identity providers into individual identities providing their identities themselves. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's called self-sovereign identity. Next click. So the 10 principles of self-sovereign identity, which is one way to kind of frame this whole concept, are really describing the structure that is self-sovereign, so a fully user-owned, user-controlled identity should have. It should have its own independent existence. It should be possible to fully control it, so the identity subject, the person that is represented through that identity, should be able to fully control it. It should allow you to get access to different interactions, into different services. It should allow you to have a transparent understanding of what happens within this identity solution, and a few other of these factors. And what we end up with in the self-sovereign identity paradigm is essentially this. So where we've seen the identity provider in the picture we saw before, we nowadays just see an identity wallet. And this identity wallet is a piece of software. It can also be a hardware wallet if you're coming from the crypto scene, that handles keys for you. And it does a bit more. It's a smart wallet. That's how we call it. Others call it differently. It doesn't only hold keys and manage keys for you or create keys, but it also holds data. It holds data about yourself, and the good thing about it is that it actually resembles just what you had in the good old analog world. All your credentials today, unlike the digital ones you might have stored with some services, are with you in this little wallet. And what self-sovereign identity ultimately does, and the best way to kind of make it very easy to understand, is that it allows you to keep your credentials with you in a digital wallet that very much works like this. The moment you want to interact using your identity, and the moment you want to present an attribute about yourself, just like your name or your ability to fulfill the minimum requirement for some kind of interaction, you can just pull out that specific credential. And the good thing about this is that you can't only put out that specific credential, but you can also decide who the source of this credential was. So was it issued by the state? Did you get it verified through a friend in this kind of web of trust setting? Did you just create it yourself without some attesting through a third party? You can fully model that on your own, and you're not dependent on one identity provider or one kind of trust issuer, but you're free to choose between a huge range of different ones. And that's the general concept of self-sovereign identity. I'm happy to talk about more of this kind of new developments today or tonight. And yeah, thank you very much.
So, as we dive in now, I think my first question is actually one that most of the people in this room could answer themselves. But just trying to get a sense of the current perspectives on the potential for identity solutions. Could you guys tell us about an experience you've had with privacy on the web? Something that worked, or maybe more applicably, something that didn't work? Greg, let's start with you.
Sure. I think the past 10 years, really, we've all had a chance to realize that there's really no such thing as privacy on the web right now. We do our very best to create our accounts and keep them secure. Most of us don't do a very good job of that because we reuse our passwords and essentially have one access that can get you into anything, and if that's breached somewhere, it's breached everywhere. It's usually not a very good password either. We've seen massive data breaches from all of these providers, from Equifax in the US, which is a data broker that essentially lost their entire database, to credit card vendors, to stores, to most recently Facebook. I think we might hear a bit more about that in a second. But the way our model is set up is to harvest as much data as possible from people and use it as a product. We are lured in with these services. The way we pay is with our data, and that is what is traded back and forth in order to more effectively market things to us. I think we're starting to see some of the damage from that now, and we're going to see more as we start to see things like better use of that data and profiling and predictions to raise the cost of insurance, to decide who gets jobs, who gets loans. And I think the chickens have not yet fully come home to roost, but they are on their way.
Yeah, for me, like the most disturbing thing on the web is I don't know how data is processed or who is using my data. So, like the most recent example for my daily use is Facebook. I mean, I don't want to like Facebook, but I just noticed that when I communicate with people on WhatsApp, that I'm not a friend on Facebook. They're like, just afterwards, there's suggested a friend, and in this, suggestion thing. And well, I just don't remember that I've ever consented to any data exchange between WhatsApp and Facebook. And so, like, the privacy policies are so not transparent, so that I don't know what really happening, like, behind the scenes. And and there's no consent asked. So this is like a very disturbing thing for me, because I just can't control the exchange of data between different players. But there's also very privacy-friendly providers. So, for example, in Germany there is a email provider, Posteo, and this is a provider you pay for. It's like €1 per month, but you can sign up completely anonymously. So you just give the wished email address and then a password. That's it. They don't collect any personal data, and it's also possible to pay anonymously for that service. So I think they're also good examples.
A quick question: who don't have a Facebook account? Okay.
Not anymore.
So, like, why I'm asking is because, like, it is not obligatory to have Facebook account, but I hope, or at least I will tell about it. But have you heard of WeChat in China? It started out as a chat platform, like an IRC. It was actually an IRC in the 1990s, just translated to Chinese. Currently, that's the largest actively used platform after WhatsApp, but it's only used basically in China. But the big difference between WhatsApp and WeChat is that WeChat is an OS in itself. So everything you do now in China is through QR codes, which you can enable new features in WeChat. You can pay for menus, you can rent a bike, like a mobike. It all happens within WeChat. Like, people don't leave the app. And as the government of China is not exactly the most pro-human rights organization in the world, they gained access to all the data that's accumulated in WeChat, which is like your Amazon, your Instagram, your Google, your Facebook, your Messenger data in one place that the government has access to. Now, in China, they are introducing the social credit system, which is basically a prediction market on your behavior, which is generally could be looked at as a good thing, but if you are talking something against the government, or you have peers in your network who are talking against the government, your social score can in real time drop. Companies like Tencent and Alibaba are working with the government to actually make this prediction model very great. And it can limit your ability to travel, to send your kids to school, to apply for loans, etc., etc. And like, this is happening. So like, this is not something that we wrote as a science fiction model. This is happening in China, and I think like this is so much more scarier than Facebook lost 50 million accounts. I'm sorry, but like, this is like 1 billion people who will have zero privacy. Not in the internet, everywhere, because in China the mobile phone usage take over. There is no PCs really. Everything goes through the mobile, and basically everything goes through WeChat now. So the government has knowledge of everything you do. And so like, the question of privacy in the internet is becoming a question of privacy everywhere, because the internet became so much of our day-to-day life that if we don't do something now, it can very easily happen everywhere. Luckily, in Europe, we have the world currently strongest privacy regulation, so we are a bit safer, but it doesn't mean that everyone falls under this category. So we have to think about like the larger picture than just like what's usually talked about.
I'm gonna go super basic. So I've been blogging stuff for a very long time, and like consciously avoided using like my real name for that, because I always had this feeling that it's nice to have different personas in places where you just don't want to interact as your like kind of legal or natural person's identity that you interact with in the more official sense. And I always still posted my pictures through Flickr, and that was my first experience with like major hacking, because I once got this email from Flickr that I should reset my password, because Flickr is a company of Yahoo, and Yahoo is that company that lost over 1 billion of user accounts, which is a number that is just unimaginable. And that was my first kind of touch point, and I think that should be like 5 years from now, where I really felt, okay, that there's something terribly wrong with this whole digital identity and how I'm able to control or even know what's going on with it. Let alone the fact that having an account at Flickr means that I have an account at Yahoo. I don't want that. Like, I want to use a service. I don't want to be a user of that parent company straight by becoming a user of a service of that parent company. That's crazy. And then last year, in the kind of peak season of crazy leak news of last autumn, I was actually like really surprised. There was this Hasso-Plattner Institute here from Potsdam that released a thing called Identity Checker or Identity Leak Checker, I think. And there you can just enter your email address, and it provides you with all of the leaks connected to that email address, or to a username, or to, holy shit. Like, none of my, I mean, swear words because this is a private section, sorry. But none of the emails I've used in the last few years was uncompromised, besides the Posteo one, which is the one I only use for like stuff that is not connected to crappy services, so for very few things. But all of the other ones, even the ones from university, the ones from stuff where I like engaged in a more political manner, like all of them were compromised. And also services that I was connected to, it's insane. And half of them I wasn't aware of. The other ones was like this typical, you get a notification, you change your password, or you maybe even forget to change your password, which is the worst. And the other ones I wasn't even aware of. And probably, and that's a terrible thing about digital identity and leaking of these centralized platforms, of these so-called honeypots, where all of the user data is stored in one single database for the whole service, is that usually the service itself realizes that it has been deprived of user data months and years after it happened. In the case of Yahoo, I think it was 2 years after it happened that they even found out that the user data was compromised. So structuring this sort of data in centralized platforms scales very well. It's very easy to handle from an organizational perspective, but from a perspective of the individual that is represented through that data, it's the worst thing to be done. And it needs to be reimagined, actually, collectively, I would say.
Absolutely, and I think it's probably apparent to everyone in this room how much privacy affects our interactions as individuals, but also on these more macro scales, entire countries, billions and billions of people affected by data breaches. And yet everyone on this panel works in blockchain, actually gets their hands dirty with it, whether it's in its practical implementation or working on the legal and regulatory frameworks behind it. And there are so many unknowns. And what are some of the risks that you can potentially see associated with privacy and decentralized technologies? Natalie, would you kick us off?
Well, yeah, actually I'm a lawyer, and I am really, every day I work with blockchain ventures. And there are a lot of, there are a lot of companies that have governance questions, and this always touches down on privacy questions. So as a lawyer, I work with the privacy concept that is laid down in the GDPR. And the GDPR is very clear on the concept of responsibilities, of what the principles are of lawful data processing, and what the rights of the individuals are whose data are processed. So, like, the biggest challenge is to fit in blockchain ventures within this framework, because like, blockchain has a decentralized nature, and GDPR is very, very much designed in a centralistic way. So they have three major players. So you have a controller, like the one controlling the data processing, and who's also responsible for the data processing. You have data processes that are commissioned by controllers for data processing, and you have on the other side the data subjects, the individuals whose data are processed. So if you look on blockchain systems, who is the controller? I mean, there's no central party you could like give the responsibility for data processing. So if you don't have a controller, it's really hard or even impossible to safeguard individual rights under GDPR, because there's no entity you can address for. So if you ask, yeah, I want to have my data deleted, so do you go to nodes? Do you go to any apps that are like on the blockchain? So you just don't know who to address. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges under GDPR.
And Greg, as the other lawyer on the panel, do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of many problems. It's definitely not the one that technical people think of first.
Yeah.
They tend to think of the right to be forgotten as the biggest problem. We all talk about blockchains being immutable, meaning that the data that's written to them can never be deleted. And if you have a right to be forgotten, you can see why that would present some issues. Another issue is what actually counts as personal data. The GDPR sets up a very broad framework, and the technical measures like encryption or like hashing, where data is transferred from a longer string to a smaller string that seems to be anonymous. These techniques don't actually fully anonymize data. So if you're running your blockchain identity service and decide to write a hash of personal data or encrypted personal data to the blockchain or to any public ledger, then you're suddenly throwing people's personal data out into the public.
And for those that are working on building these infrastructures, what do you all see?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So I'm just going to first introduce the Decentralized Identity Foundation, because I think it's sort of important. So there is a foundation where the name is fairly obvious what it does. The goal is to create a standard, but not just like by describing it, as usually protocols are described for the internet standards, but actually with code base so that it can be directly implemented to a lot of services. And this organization called Decentralized Identity Foundation, it's now backed by a lot of blockchain companies, which many of you won't know. Both Jolocom and Takano is in it, but like Microsoft, IBM, Accenture. So some of the largest companies working in public sector identity is backing this DID, Decentralized Identifier, which seems to be becoming the standard. Currently it's a W3C draft paper, so it's not completely accepted, but that will take like 5 years to become out of this draft status. And if anyone is looking into identity, look into projects if they are implementing the ID or they're implementing something else, because it's all about interoperability. So that's something that I think have to be mentioned, that these data silos are also problematic because they don't enable interoperability, because that's not part of their business model, because they have to own and harness data within their own system. So their likelihood of giving up access to other services is just if they can consume more data. And so interoperability is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, but sort of that's one of the directions that the Self-sovereign identity wants to solve, to enable interoperability by moving trust away from the organization that gave you the access to you as the person who owns now the access credentials. So that organizations can trust you always because you are the trusted person in the transaction and not a third party. And in terms of privacy, so I think like there is one big issue as well, if we are talking about blockchain and identity. So like blockchains are questionably well for identity. This is one, if like dumping data in many formats is going to be personal data, so you have to figure out a data storage mechanism, which is not a blockchain, at least not a public blockchain. But the other one is transactions, because if you just think of like a normal public key that you would use with your decentralized amazing data storage for transactions on Ethereum, you would be able to be triangulated back to your public key, because either you are using the public key to sign transactions, or you have to pay for a couple of transactions. So you essentially, the original public key, if you created like an HD key or something, can be triangulated back. So that's like another big issue that comes up quite a lot in the tech space, of like how to deal with privacy on just key management level, not even data.
Just
Yeah.
to jump in on that point, another one of those things that is potentially personal data that most people don't consider is the public key.
Yeah.
So this pseudonymous identifier that basically anything blockchain related uses as potentially personal data, if it can be linked back to an identifiable individual. So it creates tons of roadblocks for using blockchain for identity.
Yeah, I think really good points raised. I would like to answer all of them. It's impossible, so I would try to keep it short. I think what's really interesting to look at is the fact that, speaking of blockchain and identity, has been kind of going through a very quick phase of evolution, from people trying to put hashed data about an attribute onto a blockchain, and then if somebody presents it and it's hashed again, you can check that it has been hashed sometime in the past with a timestamp. People quickly realized that this is not the best way to handle identity with blockchains, luckily. And nowadays we came to a point in time where blockchains are significantly less used for natural persons, and especially in the Decentralized Identity Foundation that we're both part of, and also in the work that the German Blockchain Association is currently doing in writing a position paper on digital identity in the form of self-sovereign identity. What we're trying to propose is to not put any natural person's data, not an identifier, not a public key, nothing onto a blockchain, because it doesn't actually have to be there. And you can still have a fully workable self-sovereign identity system, and blockchains still play an incredibly important role within the identity system, because we have to still kind of consider the fact that this model of self-sovereign identity, of decentralized identity, relies on me as a person associating information with my identity that I control myself. And this information is verified or attested, as you could say, by some other party, such as, for example, today you have it with Postident or ID Now that attests your driver's license or a car sharing service, or just as the state who attests your passport or your EID card to be accurate. And the actual concept of self-sovereign identity, so often it's called like decentralized identity, self-managed identity. We have a bit of a battle of terms here, but we like to go with self-sovereign identity. What it allows you to do is to be the point of control through which this data is exchanged. So the actual thing we try to change in all of this movement is that trusted information that can be attested by a party that is retrievable via a blockchain solution. So actually organizations or IoT devices or algorithms, they can definitely have a digital identity that is mapped through a blockchain environment, and that can be incredibly useful to do so, and to have this traceability, to have this transparency in looking at what organizations are doing. But this doesn't apply to natural persons, so us here in the room who want to be protected and whose privacy should be protected. So what self-sovereign identity as a system allows you to do is to link these different environments to each other using these open standards and building blocks that the Decentralized Identity Foundation and all the different ventures engaged in that foundation are working on. So it allows you to, for example, have a blockchain that handles identities and keys from the government to be up all the time, fully decentralized, non-compromisable, running on a public blockchain network, to provide the signatures and the keys that attest credentials that you carry in your wallet. And only if you present that credential to someone, such as, for example, your driver's license issued by your local municipality, this receiver, so the service, like, for example, Car2Go, is going to check where this credential is coming from. So it's coming through you, but it has originally been attested by the government. And Car2Go is able to directly check in the public blockchain of the government whether this key is compromised, it's current, it's updated, whatever. And this is the true actual utility of this new identity paradigm that we're speaking about today. And it allows you to handle and build privacy-preserving identity systems for people in a completely novel way. Doesn't mean there's no roadblocks, there's a lot of them.
Kai, I think you have led me quite perfectly into, oh yes?
Just
go
like
on.
back to the
Response.
battle of terms. There is a really big battle of terms because in the whole blockchain space, as you might know, new terms are coined every day. And the term self-sovereign identity has some problems when you're discussing it with the government. Basically, the best description, the second best is self-managed identity. But self-sovereign means more, but it essentially doesn't mean that you become your own government. You become your own governing body of your data. But you can't claim that now you're German and then you become German because you're so self-sovereign. Or you can't, it doesn't mean that you can I could just give up my Hungarian citizenship because now I'm self-sovereign and I'm like this great person. So that's one of the battles that like is happening quite a lot because talking with regulated entities and sovereignty is a big question.
Then I have to jump in.
Yeah.
Sorry. Really brief. So if you ever encounter that situation, because what I hope is that all of you are going to be trying to push for self-sovereign identity as soon as you leave this building today. If you encounter that and somebody from a public authority, somebody from a business, whatever, asks you, so self-sovereign identity, like that's bad because I lose power. You lose power where you're not supposed to have it, and you keep it and are in a better position to actually execute it in areas where you earn it and deserve it. Because looking at the state, being the municipality today, or being the state today, accessing or getting into contact with your citizens or with your businesses is usually mediated by a third party. You have to go through a platform, either you set it up yourself or you use one that is provided by some private company in order to interact with your citizens or interact with your businesses. And what self-sovereign identity allows you to do is to directly, in a peer-to-peer fashion, interact with your citizens and businesses without an intermediary attached to you issuing a certificate or to you issuing a credential. And that is something that we haven't seen in the digital space before, unless you as a state, which the German state did in a very perfectionist manner, issue an electronic identity card to your citizen that is so good that nobody uses it. Because it basically created a huge friction and a huge barrier of entry, because you had to buy a reader to read the e-identity card. You had to buy it for, I think, over 100 euros. And I think we're right now at a take-up rate of 2% for that thing. So if you as a citizen, or also if you as a state, want to engage in a peer-to-peer fashion with each other, you should go for an infrastructure that allows you to do so without having to go through added hardware or added intermediaries. And that's, I think, what helps to bring the self-sovereign term into relation of what it actually does.
So
Sorry.
I think we know how Kai is going to answer my next question, so I'll reformulate a bit. But for the rest of the panelists, do you think that self-sovereign identity or self-managed identity is a solution to this conundrum we find ourselves in with the risks regarding decentralized technologies? So will it solve the issues that we currently have in harmonizing blockchain business models and privacy concerns? And for those that clearly think so, what do you think we need to do next to make that happen? Or what needs to change in the environment to enable it to make that happen? And for those that think no, what should we be looking towards instead?
I mean, I'm happy to go, but
Yeah.
like I wouldn't sit here if I wouldn't believe in it, I guess. So I'm on Kai's side. But essentially, like, what's important is that it can be, so there is a saying that we came up last week, is that blockchain is self-sovereign identity, that self-sovereign identity doesn't need blockchain. Because for Web3 services, everything comes down always to governance, and governance can only done by humans or very soon by AI potentially, but still there has to be an identity that it can manage or what we can manage. So like all Web3 really heavily requires systems that they can rely on that can support their sort of next level of growth. In terms of internet privacy, these systems can enable a lot of things, but it doesn't directly gonna mean that Facebook login gonna disappear. Because of the simplicity of Facebook login is not gonna be gone. They're very likely, hopefully, gonna be there a third button beside Facebook, Google, which will enable you to log in to services with privacy preserving methods. And like, of course, we can hope that Facebook would implement, because they could implement it as well. It doesn't mean that they would give up the data that they own on you. It would mean that you can access their services in a different way. But like, in the ultimate version, they could even dump all the data that they own on you into your self-sovereign identity storage, and you can own it. This is like the ultimate direction, but that's only can be if achieved with very hardcore regulations. And as we know, these companies that has a lot bigger lawyer power than most governments, these regulations are not going to be fast enough to be really follow it up. So there is a really big question of how that's going to play out in the Web2 services. But in Web3, definitely for governments, it's an amazing tool for replacing single sign-ons that are leaving, like enabling or like putting organizations in a place where they, under GDPR, for example, becoming data controllers, right? That's it. Yeah. They could just completely move away from that, because they can just rely on a signature that they know that this is a human. I don't care who is he or who is she. I just want to collect data while he's on my website. And I give him a QR code, and that's it. He's in my system, I can collect data. I'm doing it with his knowledge that because he's using my service, and then I don't fall under GDPR. So it's very easier for me. Of course, if I'm interested in who is he and I want to compete with Amazon and Google and Facebook, then yes, of course, I will ask him for everything.
Well, like the concept of self-sovereign identity really fits well in, or harmonizes well with the idea of GDPR, which is to strengthen the individual rights, like concerning that with regard to your data. And it also, when you look at the legal concept of data privacy in Germany, it's even more, because the German legal concept is the right to informational self-determination. So it really means having control on any information that relate to me. So that you are the controller of information flying around in the world. So, and as I understood it well, as having a self-sovereign identity means you can control who has access to data, how data is going to process by any players in a data processing system. So I think that would be something really enhancing privacy. Okay.
So I'm obviously a bit biased, but I think it's just like what actually helps is to just pinpoint the future vision quickly. So let's just imagine that these are two competing companies, right? Like Takanu is building self-sovereign identity and Jolocom is building self-sovereign identity, and we sit on the same panel. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense at all, because we're not going to buy each other next month or anything, and we're building the same systems. We're not intending. So we're building we're building towards the same system. We're building building blocks and modules for the same future, intending to compete in the very same environment of providing people with identities that they can truly control and own. And we already do so as well in the Decentralized Identity Foundation, where there's, I think, over 70 companies represented. And we are at the very start of seeing the potential with decentralized identifiers from different companies being resolvable through the same source, through the same universal resolver, it's called. It's one of the first really amazing modules that came out from the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and Jolocom is just about to become part of this universal resolver as well, currently writing the code for it. And what it allows you to do is to have this exact third button. It's allowing you to have a button on your website that says login with a decentralized identity. And if you click on it and you get a QR code and you get the ability to scan that QR code with whatever source of identity you choose to. You can decide to go with Jolocom, you can decide to go with Takanu, you can decide to go with Evernym, Uport, Microsoft, whatever you wish. So you truly have an identity system that allows you to be free to choose what you're going to utilize to manage your digital identity. Because the way it's handled is happening through open standards and through building blocks that everybody can have access to freely. The huge roadblock there absolutely is that we have a great kind of habit of accepting stuff that we already use. And I don't know who of you, I'm not sure if it happens with, like it didn't happen to me when I switched to a ThinkPad, but who of you has a MacBook? They sometimes do changes when you get a new operating system to the whole UX. How long does it take you to get used to that?
Very short amount of time.
Like a day at all, if at all, I think. It's incredible. Like, I think if we manage to make the change from current identity solutions like Facebook login to login with a decentralized identity as quick as this, then we're going to be successful. And I think that's actually the benchmark we have to measure ourselves against. You have to build something that is truly on par and potentially 10 times better than the stuff we're currently using. And user experience in decentralized systems, I'm not sure how many of you use PGP encryption in email. User experience, right? Amazing. On the end of the spectrum. So what we have to achieve is to build PKI-based systems with public-private key encryption that handle the most valuable data about ourselves in an incredibly usable way, right? And make people accept it. So there's a lot of challenges. As I said, I want everybody of you to leave the house picking one of these challenges for yourselves and either convince somebody to enable decentralized identity in their system or just try out the wallets that already exist in the demo pages or even the first use cases that you can already utilize and tell these companies and these actors working on it what you don't like about it, what you need to see to have it useful for you, etc., etc. Because this can only be built if all of the parties involved collaborate. And I think one of the most amazing things is that we already see the companies that in 1 or 2 years in time will be actually competing against each other on a kind of universal infrastructure layer that they all build up together. That when even these companies that in the future will compete against each other already manage to collaborate, I think it would be great if we all managed to collaborate on this to actually make it a reality.
Okay.
So I really like the vision too. I like privacy. I like the idea of having more control and more essentially owning my own data and deciding who can use it and for what, and being able to make sure that other people aren't using it for things that I don't want them to. But I'm going to be a huge wet blanket and say exactly why I think it's going to be a while before this is actually a reality. So I think 1 to 2 years is crazy talk. I think we're looking at 5 if we're lucky, and maybe more like 10. First of all, we have a two-sided market here. We have people who want to use identity services to log in, and we have companies who want people, or companies or governments or whatever, who want people to log into their services. People don't want to use a service that doesn't let you log into anything. Providers don't want to use a service that doesn't have any users. So you have this chicken and egg problem where no one wants to use something if it's not accepted, no one wants to accept it if it's not used. And you have this huge installed market base. You have billions of users, literally billions of people using Google and Facebook. These identity services have a massive lead in almost anyone who has had internet access so far. And the first internet access for people who are coming online is probably going to be through those services, not through decentralized alternatives. Number 2, the tech isn't ready. Essentially the best decentralized services we have melt down on a pretty regular basis. Ethereum can't handle a bunch of kitties. We still have major issues in terms of security to solve, in terms of scalability. I think we're quite some time away before we want to have anything that has any sort of real importance being built on these systems in terms of government identity or voting systems or things that you really need to have identity work 100% of the time. We are quite a ways away from that actually happening. And I think that's probably the biggest roadblock. Second biggest roadblock. The very biggest is people. People are just not very good at doing this stuff. We're not good at securing our passwords now. We won't be very good at securing all of our data either. We are generally pretty dumb and we're generally pretty lazy. We can't be bothered to do this stuff. And as Kai was saying, the UX around all of this stuff is terrible right now. The processes for key recovery are really also quite terrible. And the consequences for losing your ID are huge. It's not just that you're locked out of your email, it's that you are locked out of your entire life. Like where do you start if you lose your key to your whole identity? Do you go to the bank? I've tried to go to the bank and they ask for a passport or a driver's license. They want to see something to show that I'm me, and if I have nothing, where do I go? So this stuff all needs to be solved. We need scalability. We need to have these technical issues solved. We need to have proper key recovery before we can actually start talking about moving these services over. So I think it's a few years at least for the tech and a few more years beyond that to compete. And then finally, one final problem. We have all of these different competing companies, and I'm quite concerned that we're going to wind up with a million different identity services competing with each other, and I'll have just as many logins as I have now with different identity services for my healthcare and my car rental and my Airbnb, my email, everything else. So I like the vision. I really hope this is the way the world is going. It's the world I want to live in, but I think we have tons and tons of work to do before it's going to happen, and I think 2 years is way too optimistic.
So on that positive note, I'm not sure if any of the other panelists would like to respond to that, or
For an hour, yeah.
Okay, for an hour. So rather than sit and listen to Kai argue for an hour, those that would like to ask their questions out loud, let's start here.
Right, so you mentioned the problem of data breach, right? For instance, in the case of Facebook, aren't you afraid that the type of information that are going to be stored in this wallet is actually going to be much more sensitive than to what's being stored right now, and that if people start actually using these decentralized services, as you correctly mentioned, people are just dumb by nature and they tend to lose their keys or stuff like that, or just they can also be hacked. Don't you think that actually this decentralization sort of like increases the risk or at least the consequences that are linked to data breaches? That's the first question. And the second question is, how do you convince a business to actually accept you as a decentralized identity provider, right? If you can't associate an identity to your user, then what's the interest for them to actually, accept you as a built-in feature that they can offer? Because as we know, like most of the monetization and business models right now on the internet is simply based on advertising, and that advertising is done by profiling users, right? And if you can't profile users, then there's no interest for them to accept it. So two different questions. How about the data breach problem? And then the second one, how do you convince businesses to actually accept you as like a self-governed identity provider? Two questions.
Balash, can I ask you to take that one as someone who's probably had to convince
So
others?
I'm gonna start with the second one. Because basically like there can be levels of self-sovereignty as well. So like from the level that you own everything and even the service stores the data in your side and consumes that via like encrypted machine learning, it is, that's the very far end. then you own everything. You literally own it. You have a proof. The data never leaves your side. It always been channeled. That's a very small use case that's gonna work. But as you said, it's about profiling, but not about storing data on personal data. So like, you know, your mouse movement on a website is not exactly your passport number or your name or your photo. So that's where it becomes like more granular of what data is stored at the service side, what they need, what they require to have, and what they want to have. And these are not overlapping categories. So they are able to move some of these out from their servers so that they can just collect data on you, whatever you do on their service. But they don't actually have to have your name, because your name doesn't give them anything. You are a number anyways. They have to, or they are using anonymized data, because your name doesn't really gonna affect your shopping behavior, I guess. Yes, but if they don't have your name, then they don't need to care about in terms of legal regulations, because they can just rely on the single sign-on from your self-certificate.
No, like lawyers.
No, not really. I think it's not so simple to say that your name is a personal data and like a number not, because it really, you always have to dig in the question if this information relates to a identifying person. So if there's any way, like reasonable means to relate the information to a natural person, that it's personal information or personal data. So even like a user profile or, you know, a information on how you, on shopping behavior can be personal data as soon as you can relate it to an identifiable person. So
yeah, okay.
it's not that.
It's not that clear, but like it's much easier to anonymize a shopping behavior than my name.
Of course. I mean, you can like you have like user profiles on shopping behavior, and then you know you don't need to have a name or you don't like picture the person. You just relate the information and play it on a device that is like related to it. So you not necessarily related back to the person. But you always have to look really in detail on the question.
And back to the first question, which is the data breach. So sort of self-certain identity introduces the idea that you own the data. So sort of you distribute the honeypots. So even if there is a breach, even if you are not so smart and forget your password, or someone gets hold of your password, it doesn't mean that 50 million people will also lose their informations. You will lose, yes, which is really bad, but you are one and not like a whole range of people.
But then the question would be: are people really willing to shift that responsibility from the government's hands to their own hands, right? Like, I love to hold someone else accountable for my mistakes.
I'm going to ask that you attack our panelists after this so we can give some more space on the floor. I see there's a question in the back.
I have two questions as well. One question is, I've been last week. I've been for 3 days in Riga, Latvia, actually, to help clients to generate for companies, for businesses, local business over there. And there came out actually that this notary and the accountant, they wanted to have their EID actually to generate them. They told me that actually that's much more simpler, and it's simpler to approach it actually abroad because for every change, every little changes for clients would have actually, they would have to change, they would have to present all little information changes in front of notary. How the first question is so far how your solution is going to solve this issue, if ever. And the second question is as well, so for this actually for free, because once you have the EID issued, then there is no further cost actually is using it. So my second question is attached to this one, which means what's your business model on this? So can you be cheaper than free? Then free of charge. Then
Kai, would you like to answer this one?
Absolutely. I would actually also love to talk about the one about responsibility and self-sovereignty, because that's actually where it comes together. Taking responsibility means you can fuck it up. And that is something we can't put on people. Just to quickly, like, you can't put that on people. Like, yeah, you get everything, but if you fuck it up, we're not here to help you. That doesn't work, because then people will stay with the centralized services they can blame. So that's one of the UX challenges and the challenges that I tried to point out earlier. It has to solve that. Now when it comes to this whole business model question, it's a bit tricky, right? We speak about public infrastructure. We frame this here today as a universal identity layer that is provided free of charge to a wide range of people to be used. And then there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be maintained. You have to maintain the code base, you have to maintain networks, you have to build all this UX, you have to build all these supporting systems that ideally should be decentralized as well, because as soon as you have one centralized entity in there, be it a cloud service or be it a recovery system service, you have a central point of failure, a single point of failure. And then you're back at the start with a lot of detours through decentralized territory. So if we have this full broad vision of a fully decentralized, fully universal world, it's not going to be free in the sense of free, but ideally it's not going to be free in the sense of we get something else from you that is going to pay for it. So the idea here is that there's different ways to finance different parts of this future ecosystem, which I think is totally fine. We just heard that this email provider, Posteo, allows you to set up an email account that is privacy preserving, that costs you €1 a month. And I think when we look at wallet solutions, one good thing is that all of these things that we're currently building at Jolocom and as well as the Decentralized Identity Foundation are fully open source. So all of the stuff that is built right now doesn't cost you anything to continue building on, which is a huge benefit. And this is true for the whole scene. Most of these projects work fully open source. So you have a lot of kind of a lot of money that already is in these solutions that you can just pick up and continue working with. So you don't have to start from scratch. If you want to provide a wallet, you can just start with some wallet code that is already there, and you can create your own wallet on top of that with your specific UX that you handle in a different way than someone else. As this is an open system, you won't be able to prevent people from doing it in an ad-based service sense. You won't be able to make everyone pay for it. But at the same time, if we speak about this use case of, for example, people handling their driving license in a self-sovereign identity wallet, what happens in this very use case is that I have a wallet, I enter the data of my driving license, or I go with my driving license to a web service that verifies my driving license, and this web service issues a credential into my wallet. And there it sits. And then either case number one is happening, that I paid for this verification, and from that moment onwards, I have a digital attested copy of it in my wallet. This is one of these things that we probably have lazy people and people that don't want to pay not accepting it. But that's definitely one way of monetizing these systems. The other version is to build systems that are continuously privacy preserving, but that allow you to model what's modeled today and what's happening today. So the service consuming the identity credential, paying for the testing of this identity credential, as one of the kind of revenue streams that happen. And ways to do that are developed in different ways by different identity companies right now, and we're still at the very start of seeing these developments happen. But what we have to understand here is that there's a certain form of attested credentials or attributes that are not really monetizable and that shouldn't be monetizable as well. Like it isn't for me it's not a good future vision to see a world where everything we exchange is monetized and everything that you exchange with a service or that you hand over to a service is something you get paid for or you have to pay for them to accept it. But as we talk about our identities enabling us to get into interactions with other parties, these other parties' services, for example, usually have some benefit from interacting with us. And it's really the challenge about getting these services to pay for the verification, for the attestation, for the identity, just as they do today. And it's about creating clever business models that are privacy preserving, that enable these flows of value without putting a financial burden on the user for the sake of getting the users to use it. A bit cryptic, sorry.
Just one side question, if I may ask. What I don't understand is why should somebody pay for it if he gets it from the government for free? I mean, if you use your EID, you can identify, you can authenticate yourself with a better service, so you can open a company remotely and so on. With your restricted service, it's of course it's distributed, but it's not valuable for most important cases. And for the other case, you have to pay. So why should I pay for something what I have for free at a better service level? Something where I simply don't get the message.
So for state-issued identities, just to quickly, that's great. If the state pays for it, what could better happen to us, right? Like, there's nothing bad about this, and we as a company would never be against this. So for the credential like passport, EID card, driving license, if in 10 years' time, speaking in the very kind of more cautious terms, and also knowing about the speed of government, we might be able to receive all the credentials we currently receive in paper form or plastic card form as a verifiable credential through whatever source of wallet we get. And we might see wallets that are actually provided by the government. So we might see a lot of these kind of services and things, and we currently already see, for example, different first pilot projects from the British Columbian government, from the city of Antwerp in Belgium, that already work on providing these services as an infrastructure to their citizens. So there you don't need that classical kind of B2C business model, because you have it as a B2G or G2C business model, to speak in those broad terms. But there is a lot of credentials, and the concept of self-sovereign identity is really interesting or intriguing, because it allows you to have all of the credentials that make up your identity be managed from one space, from one central to you wallet. And the stuff that is handled by the government is totally fine to be handled by the government, but there's stuff that might come from social media. There's stuff that might come from your engagement with private companies in the domain of e-commerce or whatever. And there you have a totally different situation in terms of where the motivation comes from to onboard a user, how much it is worth to onboard a verified user, how much is it worth for a media site to know that it's a real person that is typing a comment in a forum instead of a bot. That might be worth 5 cents. I don't know.
And just a little bit, I just want to add, just to break it even further down. The biggest question, where is the value creation? Government issued IDs are not free. I don't know any government that give it for free. EID in Estonia is €100. And value creation in Estonia, the introduction of EID created an average €1,500 per e-citizen who applied. So value creation happened in clear taxation, clear health, extremely transparent healthcare management. So the government invested a lot of money for that infrastructure. The big issue, I'm an e-resident, I can't sign anything in Germany with that. There is no interoperability yet between Estonia and Germany. So I would need to apply for the German e-citizenship as well, which might come, but it's ADAS is coming.
Automatically with your ID card. It's on your ID card already. You have to have ID card, and there the EID is free of charge included.
But that only works for citizens.
Absolutely.
Balázs is coming from Hungary.
And in Germany.
I am a Hungarian citizen.
Before we get too deep into this conversation, yes, you had a question.
I have a question. What is going to stop me from having lots of identities, or is this something we want to encourage?
I think in my world you'd have lots of identities. You'd have I think there are two kind of competing forces here that we need to balance. There's anonymity and freedom to participate in ways that aren't necessarily linked to your real name, but there's also accountability for what you do with those anonymous IDs. So I think the ultimate vision of this in the 10-year span would be a reputation system where you can prove yourself to be a good participant or a good actor in certain areas and be able to rely on that reputation. It might not be attached to your real name, but it could be if if you suddenly became incredibly abusive or were making threats against people.
Like a social credit system of sorts.
Like a social credit system. I think this is the direction that we really might be moving in, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we have the ability to act independently, and as long as we balance it with civil liberties.
I'm just gonna take one more question, so sorry.
It sounds like there's at least two aspects, maybe more than that, of ID that we're talking about here. One is authentication. The other one is like your personal data, like who you are, the sense of who you are. And one of my main concerns with the idea of the blockchain being applied to this is the immutability of the blockchain. And I'm just wondering if you have, so the fact that my ID changes over time. I mean, if I think about my email handles, now they've changed over 20 years, and how I present myself to the world just through that little bit of information, they've changed. And I want it to change, and I don't necessarily want to be associated with the things I did in the past. Do you have a comment about that, or do you have some way to address that? Or
yeah. The concept is called off-chain data. It never even touches a blockchain. So all of your attributes, email handles, names, credit card information, whatever it is, it never actually touches a blockchain. It doesn't get registered to it, it doesn't get hashed to it, nothing. So what we do in this concept, and I really want to insist on that this is not something only Jolocom does, but actually a wide scene of companies and projects currently try to implement, is that we allow you to have a decentralized public key infrastructure to identify yourself against someone else, so the simple act of authentication without relying on one single source of trust or one single root of trust, as we currently have it in classic PKI systems. And this allows you to open a peer-to-peer channel that is trustable, where you can exchange information about yourself. And this information can either be pure simple messaging, where you message that you are what you want to say, for example, your name, or it can be the exchange of a verified or a tested credential about yourself, such as a verified email address that you can send to this other party in the peer-to-peer interaction as a signed statement, signed by your email provider, for example. And this allows you to exchange trust in a peer-to-peer manner, even though you rely on third parties that initially are responsible for issuing that trust into you. Does that make sense and kind of clear out the picture?
I think so, but I think so.
Yeah.
I can tell you this is my third week on the job, and I'm still trying to understand how this all comes together. So,
yeah. so what information is actually put into the blockchain? So if you have offline data that can be linked to an identity, and that what's in the blockchain is always going to be linked to that identity, then it can always be linked with that information at some point.
Exactly. So in the 10 years perspective, right? In the 10 years perspective that Greg opened up today, and I think it actually makes sense to speak in 5 or 10 years for a fully production system where even government credentials and stuff is in. I mean, for the 2 years perspective, I was really speaking about car sharing as the top notch as far as we might come, because driving licenses are not regulated in any sense or form. When we speak about that vision, natural persons' identities are not going to touch the blockchain anymore at all. We have that today in most current applications and in like running pilots, but for you to receive a verified credential and link it to your decentralized identity, your specific identifier doesn't have to be registered to a blockchain. It just has to be presented together with the credential that you present to the person that is attesting it for you. Then you receive it in connection with that decentralized identifier. And then in the interaction where you utilize this decentralized identifier to authenticate yourself, you can present the verified credential, for example, verified by your government. And the identifier of your government, the signature, the public key that is presented together with your credential, that has to be retrievable through a public database system, ideally through a database system that is working in a blockchain-like manner or is represented through a blockchain.
But if I use this identifier to log into my email and you see who I write to, my social graph, you can easily figure out who I am, and that identifier is then de-anonymized.
Think of it more as a proof of existence of data from a blockchain perspective, not data. There is data somewhere, it's proved, and so you can use it. So there is, on the blockchain, there is no social graph or anything like that. There are services that are building really just for discovery, so that there is a public key, but everything else happens off-chain. But from a discovery perspective, as it is running on a public infrastructure, it can be found, so it can be pointed back to the transactions that it did with you or with other parties. That is also a public key, so that then public keys are signing off-chain transactions, which can then be shown as a verified transaction to other parties if needed. That's where the technology starts to become a bit more interesting, because as many companies, as many of these directions, and then zero-knowledge proof implementations are also making the ranges a bit wider. So there is a negative future picture where what Greg was saying could happen. But I would say that for now the industry is working extremely hard together to sort of avoid as much as possible. But if Facebook or Google drops their own software and identity, that's going to be the standard. Like, that's the other way to looking at, is that if they decide to come in, because of their user base, they can just rewrite the rules. But they never did it before, so.
I just have a very short yes no question. You've used the term blockchain, and some of you have qualified it with public blockchain. Are we only talking about public blockchains?
You?
Because I just want to be clear with your commentary to make sure, has anything you said referred to a non-public blockchain?
It could.
Okay.
It could, but you weren't saying it. Your comments weren't.
No, our comments I think were public, but it.
Everything you said may or may not apply to private blockchains, but
Yeah.
was not meant to apply to blockchain. Okay.
Yes.
Just making sure.
And with that very quick question, I've been doing an absolutely terrible job at keeping time. So we're 15 minutes over, and we have lots of wine and beer left to drink. So I'm going to ask you all to give our panelists a huge round of applause.